Hi, in this video I'm going to take a look at the Amek EQ 200 plugin and compare it to my A-Design's Hammer hardware equalizer. I will show you how I match the sound between these two EQs and will let you listen to the differences on the full mix, the drum track and the vocal track. And finally I will answer the question whether for me this plugin can replace my favorite mix bus equalizer, being the Hammer. So let's go! So in the beginning of 2021 I made a video on my Hammer hardware equalizer and compared it to a plugin that emulates this equalizer. I then discussed this video in a number of Facebook groups and also in a number of online forums. And one very knowledgeable engineer told me that he also used to use the Hammer, but that he actually stopped using it after buying the Amek EQ 200 plugin. And that always stuck with me and kind of piqued my interest, so voila, this video was born. So let's have a look at the plugin website. As you can see, the plugin is from Plugin Alliance and currently it costs $199. Normally it costs, well, almost $400. But I have to say Plugin Alliance is very good with all kinds of deals. So if you subscribe to their newsletter, you can probably pick it up at some point for $99. And if you have a coupon, it will be even less. Now, if we scroll down, you can see that the plugin is based on the GML 8200 and vintage Sontex EQs. And specifically, it's based on the GML 8200 and Sontec EQs that Brainworks founder had in his possession and that he liked a lot. And these Sontec and GML EQs are from the 70s and 80s, and they were apparently one of the first parametric equalizers that were used in a major way. Now the 80s and particularly the 70s are quite a magical era in studio sound. So I'm very curious about what this is going to sound like. Now as for the Hammer, which I'm showing you a picture of right now, I've had it in my rack for probably more than 10 years now. It's a tube equalizer. And if you want to get some more information about it, you can check that out in my video in which I compare it to the Hammer plugin, which I will link at the end of this video. Now obviously the Amek EQ 200 is not intended to model the Hammer equalizer, but I'm just comparing it to an equalizer, well, my best equalizer I think, that I really like the sound of and that really lives by default on my mix bus for almost every mix that I've done in the last years. And I also use it a lot for tracking vocals and other instruments. But let's first do a quick tour of the Amek EQ 200 plugin. Okay, this is the plugin set to a size of 125%. So you can hopefully easily see it on your small telephone screens. On the left side there is a low pass filter and a high pass filter, which you can turn on and off. There are 5 EQ bands, which are fully parametric. 2 lower bands have the same frequency range. There's a frequency range for the mid band and there's another frequency range for the 2 top bands. It's possible to choose a smaller scale for the cut and boost controls so that you can more finely tune the frequencies, and you can vary the bandwidth with the Q controls, and the low and the high band can also be put into shelf mode. Now in the middle there are some interesting controls which you might not find on a lot of other equalizers, which is there's a scale, so you can increase the amount of cuts or boosts that you're doing, or lower. So you keep the same equalizer curve, but just all cuts and boosts are lowered by the same percentage. And it's even possible to completely invert what you've set up. You can turn off left and right channels. And when you turn on auto listen, it means that when you work one of the controls of the equalizer, you will only hear that band. So you can really listen to the changes that you're making on a specific band. Now on the bottom you have input gain and output gain at the very right. And next to the input gain, you see Brainworks' tolerance modeling technology, which means that you can set up every instance of this plugin to sound slightly different, like analog equalizers would, because there's always a certain variance in any components that are in an equalizer like this. And over here you can even see that it has been set up that the left and right channel are actually different models, so they will not react exactly the same, like my analog Hammer EQ, of course. There's also some stereo processing where you can basically change everything below a certain frequency to mono and increase the stereo width of the total signal. You can also set the equalizer to mid-side processing, and then the left side is the mid channel and the right side is the side channels. Parameter link means that the left and right side will follow each other, which is typically useful for stereo processing, of course. And with THD it's possible to add some saturation and density like we know from, again, analog hardware. So I've just let it set at the defaults. So let's now first have a look at how this plugin behaves compared to my Hammer equalizer on a full mix. Let me show you how I've set that up. So this is a full mix project of a track of my band The Wash, which hasn't been released as of yet, at the moment of shooting this video at least. Oh, and if you're interested, I have a full series of videos on how we produced and mixed this project, which I will link up here. Now at the very right you see my mix bus. And on the mix bus I have Cubase's external plugin, which I called Comp EQ, which is basically taking the signal out of my DAW and it takes it through my analog compressor and my analog equalizer being the hammer. So that's how I did the mix of this project. And again, if you're interested how I work with external plugins in Cubase, I'll link another video on top. But to compare this with the Amek, what I now did is I repatched this external plugin. So instead of taking the signal through the compressor and my hammer equalizer, I only took it through the compressor and then back into the DAW. Because what I've set up next is the Amek equalizer. And then what I initially did is I set up the equalizer with exactly the same settings as on the hammer, which are these. And I then used Pro Q3 to see what I needed to do additionally to make this mix sound the same as the mix with the hammer. And that's basically this picture that I'm showing you. So the thick white line here is the EQ curve that Pro Q3 suggests to make it sound more the same as the full mix with the hammer. So finally that resulted in these settings that you're seeing over here, which are actually quite different from the settings that I'm using on the hammer. But the match EQ curve of Pro Q3 then gave the following result, which is very flat. The white line really stays around, hovering around the -3 line here, except at the very high end. The hammer version still has a little bit less low end, but I didn't really have any bands in the Amek anymore to correct this, so I just left it as is. Now after that I exported the track from this project. I imported it into a new project, which I'll show you now. And as you can see I have two tracks in the full mix folder. One is the export with the hammer EQ, and the other one is the export with the Amek EQ 200 plugin, both on the mix bus following the analog compressor. So let's have a listen to the differences. So I'll just play this project, alternating between the full mix with the hammer and the full mix with the Amek. Let's start with the hammer.
Out of dark, take me apart, ready to dive. I'm just trying to find the light, and I am holding on. I am holding on. Engrave your heart, rip me apart, man, I'm alive. I'm just trying to find the light, and I am holding on. I am holding on.
So what do you think? Any preference on your end? I'll share my conclusion at the end of this video. So let's now have a look at these equalizers on the drum track. Yeah, so in the drums folder you can see three tracks. One is a stereo drum track without EQ. The next one has an external plugin on it. And this time this external plugin is patched to just my equalizer, so the hammer equalizer. And on the next track I have the Amek equalizer and the Pro Q3 to do the EQ matching later on, but that's disabled. Now the settings that I used on my hammer were these. I basically boosted low end and the high end quite generously. So let's have a listen to no EQ and what I set on the hammer. So what I then did, I set up the Amek equalizer in exactly the same way as the hammer. Now the hammer doesn't have any EQ controls, but I know that the bands are very wide on the hammer, so I just set the Q very wide on the Amek as well. And then I did an EQ match, and that led to these results. So to match the hammer sound, I would need to adjust the Amek as the white line shows. So again, that's quite a difference, most notably on the high end. So I then adjusted the Amek equalizer to the settings that you're seeing over here now. And that gave me the closest match that I could achieve, which is pretty flat. Except maybe from the very low end, but you won't hear that anyway. Now I obviously level mesh the tracks again, which you can see on the fader here. This one is set to 0 and this one is set to 0.60. So let's now have a listen to the differences between the hammer equalizer on the drum track and the Amek equalizer on the drum track. And we will start with the hammer again. So, did you hear any difference there? Let me know in the comments if you did, I'm really curious. Again, my conclusions I'll share at the end of the video. Next, let's have a look at a vocal track. So for the vocal I have a similar setup as for the drum track. I have the vocal track without any EQ. Then I have the vocal track, and this time the hammer is on this track. And I have the track with the Amek equalizer and the Pro Q3 equalizer to do the EQ matching, which is disabled while we're listening. Now on the vocal I have the following settings on the hammer, which I like as a vocal sound during the mix. It basically takes some low end out of the vocal and boosts some high end and a little bit of the mids. And this is the way it sounds.
Storm is rising, the wind is crying, stars are falling down.
Yeah, I think you can clearly hear the difference there. So the first thing that I did is I transferred the exact same settings of the hammer to the Amek EQ. And then I EQ matched the two tracks, and this was the initial result. So in order to get the same sound on my Amek track as on the hammer track, I needed to get rid of some low end between 100 and 200, and I needed to get rid of some high end above 5K. Now there's also a big discrepancy below 60-70 Hertz, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to that because there really is not enough frequency information in the vocal anyway to make that difference significant. So on the Amek EQ, I finally ended up with these settings, which were again quite different from the settings that I had on the hammer. And I spent quite a lot of time to actually match these as closely as possible. And what I finally ended up with is this EQ match curve. So that's pretty flat, all within half of a dB, I would say. Yeah, so let's have a listen to the hammer and the Amek track to see if we can hear any difference.
Storm is rising, the wind is crying, stars are falling down. Hope is rising, the world is trying to keep those stars in place. Put a smile back on your face.
So what do you hear? Put it down in the comments if you like. Now if you found it hard to hear the differences in these comparisons, I also exported the tracks from this project, and you can find the download link below in the description. So have a nice relaxed listen in your own DAW and see what you can come up with then. Now, as for a conclusion, well, first of all, I think they made a really nice plugin. Now in order to match those spectrums I had to do a lot of fine tuning, and I noticed that was really possible and very nice to do with this equalizer. I did think that it was kind of weird that I had to tweak so much and that the settings on the Amek equalizer were often very different from the ones I used on the hammer. But I guess it's also due to the fact that I don't know the curves of the hammer equalizer exactly, so I had to introduce some additional EQ points on the Amek to find the match. In general, I found that the hammer EQ, my hardware box, had some additional shine. It had a bit more color. It was less clean and less precise than the Amek EQ was. The Amek EQ really sounded much more neutral to me. So I think these equalizers are actually for quite different purposes. The hammer EQ I use as my mix bus EQ, and I put it on my mix bus at the very start of every mix. And I do that because I like the character of this device. So I put it on as a character, a coloring device, and then I mix everything through it and make all decisions when I hear that hammer sound already. On the other hand, the Amek equalizer doesn't do that for me at all. It seems more something that I would add later at the end of a mix to still finally adjust some EQ on the total mix, for example, without changing the character or the color of the mix that has been imparted in some other way prior to the Amek EQ already. I can see it being extremely useful for mastering purposes, for example, where you have a mix and you want to maintain the character of that mix, but just do some fine tuning or tweaking of specific frequencies. So answering the question that I posed in the beginning, will this EQ replace my hammer EQ on the mix bus? Well, no. Now, if you like this video or found something useful in it, please share it, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the little bell icon so you know when I post another video. In the video on your top right here, you can see how I compare my hammer EQ to the plugin that emulates the analog hardware. Have a look at that, enjoy, and see you soon.